Welcome to a story that defies belief, yet every word is true. Before we begin, leave a comment about where you're watching from and what time you heard this account. Stockholm, Sweden. Spring of 1895. In a modest apartment on Drottninggatan Street, surrounded by maps and meteorological charts, Salomon August André was drafting the most audacious plan of the century. At 41, this mechanical engineer and physicist had already made his name through solo balloon flights in his craft, the Svea. But what he envisioned now would either make him immortal or kill him. The North Pole. Ships had been crushed. Men had died by the dozens, frozen or starved in the endless white. Every attempt to reach it had ended in failure. But André had conceived something revolutionary. He would fly there. When André presented his proposal to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences in February 1895, the reaction split between genius and suicide. A hydrogen balloon would launch from Svalbard, drift north over the pole, then continue to Russia, Canada, or Alaska. 6 days at most. Perhaps as few as 30 hours. In a single flight, Sweden would achieve what decades of expeditions had failed to accomplish. The timing was perfect. Sweden hungered for glory, and Norway had produced Fridtjof Nansen, whose expedition had pushed closer to the pole than any before. For Swedish patriots, André's balloon represented a chance to leapfrog their rivals in one dramatic bound. The funding came quickly. King Oscar II contributed 30,000 kroner. Alfred Nobel donated 40,000. Within months, over 130,000 kroner had been secured to build the most sophisticated balloon ever constructed. The balloon, named Örnen, the Eagle, was massive, 13 stories tall, with a capacity of 170,000 cubic feet of hydrogen. Constructed of triple-layered Chinese silk and manufactured in Paris by Henri Lachambre, it represented the cutting edge of aeronautical engineering. Yet warning signs appeared. André had the balloon delivered directly to Svalbard without proper testing. When inflated at Danes Island in summer 1896, it was leaking hydrogen at far higher rates than promised. A balloon that should lose only small amounts of gas over days was hemorrhaging enough to make the journey extremely risky. André dismissed the concerns. He recalculated and declared the mission still feasible. More troubling was his steering mechanism. 3 long drag ropes would dangle from the balloon and drag across the ice below. By adjusting altitude, the crew could theoretically steer. Combined with sails, this would provide rudimentary control. The problem, the system had never been tested in Arctic conditions. Critics pointed out that ice formation could add tremendous weight. Arctic winds were unpredictable, and there would be no way to land safely on moving pack ice. But André had become a prisoner of his own vision. Too much money raised, too many expectations created. The Swedish press had transformed him into a national hero before he'd even departed. For the expedition, André chose 2 companions, Niels Strindberg, a 24-year-old physicist and photographer, and Knut Frenkel, a 27-year-old civil engineer. Both possessed the confidence and ambition that made André's vision seem inspiring rather than suicidal. Strindberg was engaged to Anna Charlier, a young woman he planned to marry upon his triumphant return. In his final letter to her before departure, he wrote, "My thoughts are with you always. When we reach the pole, the first thing I shall photograph is your picture, which I carry next to my heart. Wait for me, my dearest. I will return to you crowned with glory." He had no way of knowing that this letter would become his epitaph. The 1896 attempt never left the ground. The winds blew consistently from the north, which would have carried them back toward Norway. After weeks of waiting, the hydrogen leaked away, and they were forced to return to Sweden. The delay only intensified public anticipation. Throughout winter 1896-1897, Swedish newspapers ran regular updates. André delivered lectures to packed halls, describing the wonders they would witness from their aerial vantage point. What he didn't speak about was the fundamental question: What happens if something goes wrong? If the balloon comes down hundreds of miles from help, in terrain that had killed so many before? They would be utterly alone, with no possibility of rescue. By summer 1897, preparations were complete. The expedition departed Stockholm on May 18th aboard the gunboat Svensksund. Over 40,000 people lined the docks. Bands played, flags waved. On the dock, Strindberg held Anna in his arms one final time, kissing her as the crowd cheered. She watched through tears as the ship steamed north, carrying her fiancé toward the edge of the known world. What none of them knew was that they were sailing toward a mystery that would consume them completely. A disappearance so total that it would become one of the most haunting riddles of the polar regions. And when the answer finally emerged 33 years later, it would be more disturbing than anyone had feared. Danes Island, Svalbard. July 11, 1897. The weather had finally turned. After weeks of frustrating delays, the wind was blowing steadily from the southwest, the exact direction André had been waiting for. At 1:46 p.m., the top of the plank hangar was dismantled, revealing the massive silhouette of Örnen straining against its moorings. The three men climbed into the wicker gondola, already weighted down with provisions, scientific instruments, cameras, and survival equipment. They carried 2 rifles, a shotgun, a revolver, and significant ammunition. They had currencies from multiple countries, US dollars, Russian rubles, Scandinavian kroner, in case they drifted into foreign territory. They even carried a collapsible dinghy in case they needed to cross open water. Most importantly, they carried 36 carrier pigeons in small cages, living messengers that would carry their progress back to civilization. André dictated one last telegram to King Oscar II and another to Aftonbladet, the newspaper holding exclusive press rights to the expedition. His voice was steady, confident. Then he gave the order. The support team cut the last ropes. Örnen rose slowly, majestically, into the Arctic sky. The crowd watching from shore erupted in cheers. Hats flew into the air, men shouted blessings, women wept. The 3 explorers waved from the gondola as they drifted north toward immortality. Then, disaster. Moving low over the water, the balloon was pulled down by the enormous drag of the several hundred-meter-long ropes scraping across the ground. So far down that the gondola dipped into the freezing water. The friction twisted the ropes violently, and one by one they began unscrewing from their attachment points. These were safety attachments that André had reluctantly agreed to install, mechanisms designed to allow the ropes to detach if they got caught on obstacles. Now, within the first few minutes of flight, they were failing catastrophically. From the shore, the support team watched in horror as most of the drag ropes fell away. 530 kilograms of essential steering equipment gone in seconds. Simultaneously, the 3 men could be seen frantically dumping sandbags overboard, 210 kilograms of ballast, to lift the gondola clear of the water. In less than 5 minutes, 740 kilograms of critical weight had been lost. The carefully calculated flight plan, the steering mechanism André had spent years perfecting, the control that would allow them to navigate toward the pole, all of it was gone. Örn had transformed from a supposedly steerable craft into an ordinary hydrogen balloon with a few trailing ropes, completely at the mercy of the wind. The 3 explorers had no means to direct it toward any particular destination and had lost almost all their ballast for stability. Lightened, the balloon shot upward to 700 meters, far higher than planned. At this altitude, the lower air pressure caused hydrogen to escape even faster through the 8 million stitching holes in the envelope. The balloon that was already leaking was now bleeding gas at an accelerated rate. Within minutes of launch, the expedition had gone from triumphant to doomed. The balloon drifted north and disappeared from sight. The support team stood on the shore, staring at the empty sky, knowing something had gone terribly wrong, but powerless to help. All they could do was wait for messages. The first pigeon arrived on July 13th at a Norwegian fishing station on the northwest coast of Svalbard. The message, written in Andre's hand, read, "From Andre's polar expedition to Aftonbladet, Stockholm, July 13th, 12:30 p.m., 82 degrees, 2 minutes north latitude, 15 degrees, 5 minutes east longitude. Everything well on board. This is my third message by carrier pigeon." Everything well on board. That was the last confirmed communication ever received from the three men. The other pigeons either died in the Arctic cold, were killed by predators, or simply vanished into the vast white emptiness. But that single message was a lie, whether intentional or not. Everything was not well on board. The balloon was leaking catastrophically. They had no steering capability. They were drifting helplessly at the mercy of Arctic winds that could blow them anywhere or nowhere. What happened over the next 65 hours would only be revealed 33 years later, when searchers finally discovered Strindberg's waterlogged diary and his photographic negatives, miraculously still developable after decades in the ice. The images and journal entries told a story of growing desperation. The balloon continued losing altitude. The men threw more equipment overboard, anything they could spare, to keep it aloft. They passed through thick fog banks. Ice formed on the envelope, adding tremendous weight. The gondola periodically struck the ice below as the balloon bounced up and down. For 65 hours, they drifted through a white hell, unable to land safely, unable to maintain altitude, unable to control their direction. Sleep was impossible. Every moment required vigilance to prevent the gondola from being smashed against the ice. Finally, on July 14th, approximately 300 kilometers north of Danes Island, the inevitable happened. The balloon had lost so much hydrogen that it could no longer remain airborne. At roughly 7:30 a.m., Ernan made a hard landing on the pack ice. The three men climbed out of the gondola, exhausted, disoriented, but alive. Strindberg photographed the deflated balloon lying across the ice, a massive silk corpse that had carried them to the middle of nowhere. They took stock of their situation. They were 82.5 degrees north latitude, stranded on moving pack ice hundreds of kilometers from any land. They had survived the flight, but now they faced something potentially worse. They would have to walk home. The pack ice stretched in every direction, an infinite white desert of pressure ridges, open water leads, and constantly shifting terrain. The nearest safe land was Franz Josef Land to the east, or Svalbard to the south. Both were impossibly distant, but Andre, ever the optimist, refused to accept defeat. They had supplies, they had weapons, they had sledges salvaged from the gondola. They would march south towards safety, hunting seals and polar bears for food along the way. What none of them understood yet was that the ice beneath their feet was drifting north almost as fast as they could walk south. They were on a frozen treadmill, marching for their lives against an enemy they couldn't see or fight. The real nightmare was just beginning. The Arctic pack ice is not a solid surface. It's a living maze of pressure ridges, open water channels, and jagged ice blocks that can tower 3 stories high. When the three men began their march on July 14th, they carried sledges loaded with over 200 kilograms of equipment. They had salvaged what they could: scientific instruments, provisions, rifles, and most importantly, Strindberg's cameras and photographic plates. Andre's plan was straightforward. They would march east toward Franz Josef Land, where supplies had been cached by previous expeditions. Roughly 400 kilometers, manageable in 6 to 7 weeks. They were physically fit, armed, equipped with provisions. They could hunt seals and polar bears to supplement their food. It seemed survivable. What Andre didn't understand was the Coriolis effect on ice drift. The pack ice beneath their feet wasn't stationary. It was drifting with ocean currents, deflecting to the right due to the Earth's rotation. For every kilometer they marched south, the ice carried them north almost as fast. They were walking on a treadmill made of frozen ocean. By July 22nd, 8 days after the crash, they had traveled 36 kilometers. When Andre took astronomical observations to determine their position, he discovered they were only 7 kilometers closer to land. The ice had carried them backward almost as fast as they marched forward. The realization was devastating. But Andre couldn't admit defeat. On July 27th, he made a new decision. They would abandon Franz Josef Land and head southwest toward the Seven Islands, the northernmost point of Svalbard. It was closer. They continued marching, day after day across broken ice. The temperature hovered just above freezing, warm enough to make everything wet, cold enough to drain their body heat constantly. They began suffering from what they called sledge sickness, nausea, weakness, stomach cramps. Andre dosed them with morphine and opium to manage the pain. Food became an obsession. They hunted seals. They killed a massive polar bear and spent days butchering it, loading the meat onto their sledges. They ate the meat barely cooked over alcohol stoves. What they didn't know was that polar bear liver contains lethal concentrations of vitamin A. A single meal can cause hypervitaminosis. A. Severe headaches, nausea, peeling skin, liver damage. The symptoms matched perfectly with what they recorded in their diaries. Strindberg continued photographing their journey. His images, later recovered, show exhausted men standing beside piles of equipment, ice stretching to the horizon. In one photograph, a polar bear lies dead on the ice, massive and white. In another, the 3 men pose with rifles, but their faces tell the true story. Hollow, desperate, haunted. Strindberg pulled out Anna's photograph from his pocket one evening to dry it after fording another lead. The image had faded from moisture and cold. He couldn't even see her face clearly anymore. He stared at the ghostly outline of the woman he had promised to marry and tucked it back into his coat. The Arctic summer was ending. By mid-August, the temperature began dropping. The sun dipped closer to the horizon each day. The ice was breaking up more frequently, forcing them to take to their makeshift boat and paddle across channels of freezing water. At one point, an entire sledge fell through thin ice. One of the men jumped in after it, fishing equipment from the freezing water, while his companions pulled him back to safety. They were hallucinating. Andre wrote increasingly confused passages in his diary. Strindberg's photography became erratic. The combination of physical exhaustion, inadequate nutrition, possible vitamin A poisoning, and the psychological stress of their situation was breaking them down. On August 4th, after 3 weeks of marching, they made a decision born of desperation. They would stop trying to reach land and set up a winter camp on a large, stable ice floe. They would wait out the winter and resume marching in spring. It was reasonable. They built a substantial shelter from ice blocks and canvas. They had plenty of polar bear meat. They could survive until spring. 2 weeks later, the ice beneath their camp fractured. In the middle of the night, a crack opened directly under their tents. The ice floe split apart. They scrambled onto separate ice pans, watching in horror as their carefully organized camp broke into pieces. Equipment fell into the water. Meat supplies drifted away. They spent 3 desperate days trying to reunite their scattered supplies, jumping between ice floes, using their boat to ferry equipment across channels of open water. Finally, on October 5th, exhausted beyond measure, they spotted land. Kvitoya, White Island, appeared on the horizon. After 88 days on the drifting pack ice, they had reached solid ground. They pulled their boat and remaining equipment onto the shore. Strindberg photographed the landing. They had survived against impossible odds. They had warm clothing, working rifles, medicine, and plenty of food. Winter was coming, but they had reached safety. Andre's diary, maintained meticulously for 3 months, ends abruptly. The final entry is October 7th, just 2 days after landing. 3 short sentences about the weather and their camp. Then nothing. Within days of reaching land, they were dead. They had everything needed to survive. They were probably only days or weeks from being picked up by seal hunters who regularly visited Svalbard. But something went wrong, something that killed them quickly and completely. And for 33 years, nobody would know what happened to them. For 33 years, the Arctic kept its secret. The Swedish public waited for news that never came. In the first months, hope remained alive. Search expeditions were organized. Newspapers published reports of possible sightings, a balloon spotted by Inuit hunters, wreckage found on Russian shores. The stories became increasingly fantastical. In apartments across Sweden, people gathered around photographs of the three men, speculating about what had happened. Anna Charlier waited. Niels's fiancé lived in Stockholm, performing piano lessons to support herself, wearing the engagement ring he had given her before departure. The entire nation had been invested in the expedition's success. But Anna's loss was hers alone. Years passed. The 1900s became the 1910s, then the 1920s. The mystery faded from daily conversation, but never disappeared from Swedish consciousness. It had become part of the national mythology, a cautionary tale about ambition. Anna eventually married an English teacher named Gilbert Hawtrey in 1913, 13 years after Niels disappeared. She moved to America, then to England, carrying his memory across the ocean. She lived until 1949, dying without ever knowing what had happened to the man she loved. Then, on August 5, 1930, everything changed. A Norwegian sealing ship called the Brattvåg landed on Kvitøya, a desolate island typically inaccessible to all vessels. The summer of 1930 had been unusually warm. The pack ice surrounding the island was gone. Two crew members, Olaf Salin and Karl Tusvik, went ashore looking for fresh water. They spotted something impossible protruding from the snow, a piece of metal. It was a boat, the makeshift vessel constructed from Ernen's wicker gondola. Inside lay equipment still intact, scientific instruments, tools, provisions sealed in ice, and then they found an engraved boatswain's hook that connected them to a legend. André's Polar Expedition, 1896. They called for the ship's captain, who arrived with the ship's scientists. As they carefully excavated around the boat, they found clothing, equipment, a Swedish flag preserved in ice, and bones. The first skeleton was identified by monogrammed letters on the jacket, Salomon August André himself. The upper body was largely destroyed by polar bears. As the team excavated further, they found more remains. They recovered André's diary, though the pages were frozen together in solid ice, sealed by glue that had liquefied and refrozen. They also discovered a camera with 5 exposed film rolls still inside. The photographs, somehow preserved for 33 years, had a chance to tell their story. The discovery made international headlines. The Swedish nation experienced a strange mixture of emotions: grief, wonder, and the beginning of understanding. The photographs were carefully developed. Strindberg's final images emerged from the chemical baths, showing the 3 men on Kvitøya in the days before their deaths. Images of men who had endured 3 months of Arctic hell, only to die within days of reaching safety. But the photographs didn't show what had killed them. André's diary pages remained frozen for months. Museum conservators worked for weeks, heating the frozen pages millimeter by millimeter, watching André's handwriting emerge from the ice like a message from the grave. When the pages finally separated, they revealed increasingly erratic entries. The diary documented their ice march in meticulous detail: distances traveled, supplies consumed, locations of seals and polar bears killed. But on October 7th, after only 2 days on Kvitøya, the entries stopped abruptly. The last entry was 3 short sentences describing the weather and the camp. Thermometer at 9 degrees. We were west-northwest of Cape Wien. Fièvre? Fièvre, French for fever. Then silence. Among the remains, searchers found something that revealed the personal tragedy beneath the historical mystery. A small locket around Niels Strindberg's skeleton, inside of which was a lock of hair. Anna's hair kept close to his heart throughout the entire ordeal. There were also letters written in shorthand that Strindberg had composed but never been able to send. Messages to Anna hidden among the frozen belongings of a man who had died before he could tell anyone goodbye. The bodies showed signs of vitamin A poisoning. The skin bore characteristic peeling and damage. There were indications of malnutrition and trichinosis from undercooked polar bear meat. Analysis suggested hypothermia as the temperature dropped rapidly as autumn turned to winter. But the exact cause of death remained uncertain. What was certain was that 3 men within sight of salvation, who could have lasted until spring when seal hunters would have arrived, had instead died suddenly within days of reaching land. The mystery that had defined a generation was finally resolved in its facts, but not its truth. The bodies had been found. The diary had been read. The photographs had been developed. But the Arctic had revealed its secret only partially. It would never fully explain what happened on White Island in October 1897. The mystery of what killed André and his companions has haunted polar historians for nearly a century. Yet the answer was always hidden in the ice with them, waiting to be discovered. 3 theories dominated the discourse. The first was freezing, a simple answer for men trapped in the Arctic. But it doesn't hold under scrutiny. Meteorological records from autumn 1897 show the temperature never dropped below 15 degrees Celsius in the region. Difficult, but not lethal for men with sleeping bags and bear furs. Men like these, hardened by 3 months on pack ice, wouldn't succumb so quickly. The second theory was suicide. Despair-driven men with access to opium and morphine in their medical supplies. But when the final camp was excavated, searchers found no empty vials, no evidence of deliberate overdose, no spent cartridges. The third theory was the one that ultimately prevailed. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Inside their shelter on Kvitoya, the 3 men had a primitive stove constructed from a salvaged paraffin lamp. They built it into their ice walls to stay warm as temperatures plummeted. The shelter was well insulated, sealed tight against the Arctic wind. But there was a problem. The primitive stove, wedged into their ice block shelter, burned unevenly. In the incomplete combustion, it consumed oxygen and produced carbon monoxide instead of harmless carbon dioxide. Carbon monoxide is odorless, colorless, and deadly. It binds to hemoglobin with an affinity hundreds of times greater than oxygen. Victims don't realize they're being poisoned until they're already incapacitated. Strindberg collapsed first. His companions might have noticed him suddenly weak, confused. They might have tried to help, tried to move him outside where fresh air could revive him. But by then, they too were breathing the poison. André recorded fièvre, fever, in his diary. But it wasn't fever. It was the confusion and disorientation of carbon monoxide poisoning, misinterpreted by a man whose mind was being starved of oxygen. According to Strindberg's pocket diary, he died first, either from a heart attack or from the accumulated toxins. André and Frenkel lived 2 more weeks. 2 weeks watching their companion's body freeze, weakening day by day as they inhaled poison from the fire that was meant to keep them alive. Then they too succumbed. What makes this tragedy so profound is the proximity to survival. Had they understood the danger of imperfect combustion in an enclosed space? Had they left a gap in their carefully sealed shelter for ventilation? Had they simply gone outside more often? They were rescued by the ice, preserved perfectly for 33 years by sub-zero temperatures. Frozen at the moment of their death, waiting for someone to find them. The legacy of André's expedition extends far beyond the tragic deaths of 3 men. It transformed Arctic exploration, proving both the incredible potential and terrible limitations of emerging technology. It demonstrated that reaching the North Pole required more than engineering genius and determination. It required respect for forces beyond human control. In Sweden, the expedition became embedded in national consciousness as both inspiration and warning. André was no longer simply a failed explorer, he became a symbol of the price of ambition, of pushing beyond the boundaries of human knowledge and capability. The Swedish nation that had celebrated his departure with flags and cheers was forced to confront the hollow victory of finding only bodies and frozen artifacts. Anna Charlier received news of Niels' death while living abroad, married to another man, carrying a lock of her lost love's hair in a locket around Niels' frozen skeleton at the bottom of the world. She lived until 1949, never speaking publicly about her loss. The photographs developed from Strindberg's camera revealed the final days. Images of 3 exhausted men posed against the Arctic landscape, trying to maintain dignity while dying. The last photographs ever taken by human beings in that desolate place. The balloon Örnen, which had seemed magnificent when it rose into the sky in 1897, lay scattered across the ice in fragments. The great engineering achievement reduced to wreckage. Today, on the island of Kvitoya, a small monument marks the location where the 3 men spent their final weeks. One of the most remote monuments in the world, visited perhaps once or twice per year by research vessels, brave enough to reach that desolate rock in the Arctic Ocean. But the true monument is not made of stone. It's written in the pages of André's diary. It's frozen in recovered photographs. It's embedded in the historical consciousness of Sweden and the Arctic regions. It's the story of 3 men who dared to imagine that human ingenuity could overcome the infinite hostility of the Arctic. They were wrong, but their failure taught humanity something invaluable, that some frontiers demand more than courage and technology. The mystery of André's expedition was never really about how they died. It was always about why they tried. And that question, perhaps, will never be fully answered.